Listen to that. New microphone. Hi, everybody. Alongside a racing nerd, I am also an expert in schadenfreude. In my opinion, there's nothing more therapeutic than having a laugh at something else's expense, be that thing a company, a sports team, or even an individual person. As such, I tend to gravitate towards stories about funny cars. No, not those funny cars, but those are cool too. I'm talking more about cars or tech that had a lot of hype behind them or looked to be a world beater on paper, and then failed to reach expectations. I guess we can call this a new series on the channel. Welcome to Funny Cars. Now, it's only right that we start this series off with a properly good story. The first story we're going to go over concerns the 1992 Ferrari F92A Formula 1 car. Only 4 people were ever allowed to drive it. Ferrari spent millions upon millions of dollars building and upgrading this car. It was their love, it was their passion, it was their fault it didn't live up to expectations. To set the scene, through the late 80s and early 90s, the Scuderia was at a transition point, or at a point of crisis, depending on who you ask. Before the events of this story, Alain Prost had just been fired for saying that his car drove like a truck, and he was taking what was described as a sabbatical year before returning to F1 in 1993 with Williams. Up top, former team principal Luca de Montezemolo had been appointed president of Ferrari in November of '91, the third one in the 4 years after the death of Enzo. After John Barnard left the team in 1990 for Benetton and later Toyota's abortive effort to enter the F1 scene, they hired a new technical director in Steve Nichols, formerly of McLaren, where he was the chief designer and lead engineer behind the mythical MP44. For lack of a better comparison, they had hired Adrian Newey before Adrian Newey. As I mentioned, Luca was team principal in the 1970s, where, under his watch, Ferrari won the World Drivers' Championship with Niki Lauda in 1975. In a boys' club type move, Lauda was also hired in an advisory role, putting the band back together just like old times. The Tifosi must have been looking at the world much brighter than usual. Which was good, because life as a Ferrari fan was bleak, at least for their standards. This can be kinda traced back to the introduction of the 3.5-liter engine formula back in 1989. With the exception of McLaren in '91, every championship had been won with power from a V10 engine, which was seen as the nice middle ground between the cheap but underpowered V8 and the expensive but thirsty and monstrous V12s. Simply put, Ferrari was too set in its ways to pivot away from their famous V12s and their mantra of engine power or bust. That way of thinking would pay dividends if every race was at a track like Monza or Spa. The previous year they had gone winless, even with the Professor and Jean Alesi behind the wheel. So, going into 1992, hopes were high. Nichols and head designer Jean-Claude Migeot took up the task of building an entirely new car for the 1992 season. And they went radical with it. The most striking thing was their revolutionary double flat-bottom floor design, which was built to produce more downforce. It was exactly what it said on the tin. One floor was attached to the monocoque of the car, and then that floor was bolted a few millimeters above a second floor that was closer to the ground, leaving a gap in between them. In theory, air passing through the gap in the two floors would be much less restricted, and would help suck the car down to the ground more effectively. The only thing against it was that it looked very out of place. You look at the cars that everyone else brought to the table, and they're all very low slung. They run very low to the ground to extract as much downforce as possible. And then you look at Ferrari's entry, and it looks like someone jacked the ride height up. It looked odd, but hey, if it works, it works. The double floor necessitated the exhaust to be raised up a bit, and the radiators to be made wider than usual to accommodate for the lack of vertical room, so it made the side pods look like they had been ripped off a fighter jet. Alongside the new floor, they also designed a new monoshock front suspension, which contrasted with a rear suspension design that was running on 4 years of life, and a new raised nose cone design, the first time Ferrari had tried it. Man, these aerodynamic enhancements must have been making Mr. Aero is for people who can't build engines do backflips in his grave. Immediately, there were some concerns. On-track testing didn't start until 2 weeks before the season began in Kyalami. That seems normal now, but back then there was unlimited testing. Some of the back-of-the-grid teams had this same problem back then, where they didn't or couldn't do much testing for various reasons, but when you consider that Ferrari owned their own test track, it kind of feels inexcusable. I think now's a good time to discuss the driver lineup. The ever-reliable but ever-unlucky Jean Alesi was retained to drive the flagship number 27, but in place of Alain Prost comes wonder kid and potential star of the future, Ivan Capelli. Ivan had made his bread driving for Leighton House March, where he had scored 3 podiums and a grand total of 25 points in, frankly, unreliable mid-pack equipment. This looked to be the 29-year-old's big break in a front-running car. Nicola Larini was their designated test driver, and select testing was also done by a returning Alessandro Nannini, making his first rounds in a race car after the helicopter crash that tore up his arm. In the first qualifying session of the new season, Alesi and Capelli stuck their cars in 5th and 9th. Not bad in a vacuum, but when you look at the timing sheets, you'll see that Capelli was 1.1 seconds behind Alesi and almost 3 full seconds down on Nigel Mansell's pole time. Now, to be fair, Nigel and Riccardo Patrese were running in the Williams FW14B, the most technologically advanced car to ever grace the Formula 1 grid, so that benchmark won't be leaned on as much as in the past. But to be a full second slower than your teammate in equal machinery, that's concerning. Neither car finished the race as they both dropped out with engine issues. The new Tipo 038 engines couldn't handle the G-loads and overheated, but even before they tapped out, it was evident that they were down on power. Said power gap became even more obvious at the next race weekend at Mexico City. In the speed traps, the Ferraris were 9 miles an hour slower, almost 14 kilometers an hour slower, than the fastest cars on the grid. Even the Scuderia Italia cars outperformed them, even in qualifying. JJ Leto and Pierluigi Martini stuck their cars in 7th and 9th on the grid. Alesi and Capelli qualified 10th and 20th. Capelli was 1.8 seconds down on Martin Brundle in 4th and 0.8 seconds behind his teammate. This sorry display was Ferrari's lowest qualifying spot since 1981. To add insult to injury, Ivan then wrecked out on lap 1 in an accident with Karl Wendlinger, and Alesi's engine again expired. Brazil was a respite from the usual disappointment, with both cars making it all the way and scoring points, with Alesi finishing 4th and Capelli finishing 5th. In Spain, Ivan outqualified Jean, and then the team scored a podium, with Jean finishing in 3rd. Capelli looked to be in a point-scoring position as well, but he spun off with 3 laps to go in rainy conditions. But then, at Imola, they returned back to earth. Capelli spun out on lap 12, and Alesi crashed with Gerhard Berger's McLaren on lap 39. Through the first 5 races of the season, it was very disappointing. And then the blame game started. Publicly, Ferrari placed their initial struggles at the feet of the new floor. They were telling people that it was flexing too much and it was upsetting the balance of the car, but anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together would know that the blame was to be pointed at the engine. However, the thing is, there was a very strict propaganda policy set in place. Criticism of a Ferrari engine is strictly forbidden. You were not allowed to speak about any issues the engine may have. It was either blame something else, or tell the world that there is no problem. Capelli had a horror run from there. On top of the spin at Imola, he wrecked it again at Monaco, famously backing into the wall at La Rascasse and hoisting himself up at a 45-degree angle. At Montreal, the power gap was evident once again, and then he clattered the wall in turn 4. In his own words, quote, "Everything was normal until the crash. Something went wrong at the rear end. As I accelerated out of the corner, the car went straight on into the barrier and hit very hard. I was lucky to not have been hurt." He was physically okay, but it was obvious from there that he was very shaken by the whole experience. Second driver status was confirmed as upgrades were going solely to Alesi, such as a new transverse gearbox and an updated floor design. The spare car was designated solely to Alesi as well. If Capelli totaled his car in practice, he was shit out of luck. Even off the track, Ivan was struggling. He had spent so much time at March that the transition to Ferrari came with a lot of culture shock. He struggled to properly communicate technical issues to his crew in his native tongue since he was so used to doing it in English. Niki Lauda was a useful communication tool, but his advice was largely ignored. And that's not even covering the diehard press. I said before that the team went the way of blaming the new floor for the sluggish start, but the Italian media, namely Autosprint magazine, instead went the route of blaming it on the drivers, particularly writing scathing puff pieces about Capelli, further giving credence to my theory that employment by Scuderia Ferrari is the most hostile environment known to mankind, second only to the vacuum of space. Despite the constant press complaining and Ivan slowly losing the will to go on, Luca assured the public that he would see out the rest of the season. From Canada onwards, the main goal for everyone turned to just finishing the season so they can start all over next year. The car was still rife with issues, but it was proven to the public that the floor was not the issue. Far from it. At the French Grand Prix, it began to rain, and the double floor design produced a lot more downforce than everyone else, and let Alesi run on dry tires for longer than anyone else on track. Of course, neither car finished as yet again, the engines grenaded. At Silverstone, Alesi and Capelli were 4.7 and 5.5 seconds respectively off of Nigel Mansell's godly pole time, which would have only permitted the top 12 to start under the 107% rule. All of the upgrades that were put onto the car ended up having an adverse effect too, as they were sacrificing speed. The new floor was to prove whether or not there was an aero imbalance, which it ultimately proved that there was not, and then the transverse gearbox that they had put in made the car wider and screwed up airflow in two of the air channels underneath the car. It felt like the aero department and chassis department were sent on a wild goose chase to fix a problem that didn't exist. Because that's exactly what the case was. In an interview with Motorsport.com, Jean-Claude Mijaud testified that pointing out flaws in a Ferrari engine would be akin to swearing in church, and the blame was put on the aero department to deflect the criticism away from where it truly belonged. Later, they figured out what the problem was. The engine was suffering from a defect called blow-by. Now, blow-by is when oil leaks from the piston rings in the combustion chamber and is not burned. Alesi claimed that all this losing of oil put them down 40 to 50 horsepower. In short, the engine was losing oil at a faster rate than what is considered normal. Eventually, it would run out of oil, and then they had to put in a second oil tank to keep the poor thing lubricated for an entire race distance. This new oil tank would then make the new monoshock suspension harder to set up. Jesus, this thing's like a Bethesda game. Every time one problem's fixed, another one shows up. Moving on, Ferrari showed up to Spa-Francorchamps with a new, upgraded car, the F92A, complete with a new front wing, updated suspension, and more importantly, a more rigid housing for the engine, so as to keep it from having any more blow-by issues. Capelli then retired 3 straight times after that, continuing engine trouble at Spa, a crash at Monza, and engine trouble again at Estoril. Estoril would end up being Ivan Capelli's final race for Ferrari, as he was then released and replaced with test driver Nicola Larini. Larini had been testing an updated F92A with an experimental active suspension system that they had been looking to roll out completely in 1993. This system made his car 30 kilograms heavier than the active suspensionless car that Alesi was running. For the final 2 races, Alesi would score a 5th and 4th at Japan and Australia, while Larini finished out of the points. By the end of the season, Ferrari had just scored 21 points, somehow still eking out a 4th place finish in the constructor standings in the process. Capelli finished 13th in the standings with only 3 points to his name. Alesi finished 7th with 18. Jean Alesi would continue to race in F1 until his retirement in 2001, but this season broke Ivan Capelli. After being dropped by Ferrari, he took a ride at Jordan for 1993, but he just couldn't find that competitive spark that he had in the past. After DNQing at Interlagos, he left Formula One for good. He would then move on to race in the FIA GT Championship and race in touring cars before retiring. His last race was in 2017. He now does commentary for Italian language coverage of Formula One. Gerhard Berger was drafted in to replace Capelli, but even with his experience in a more reliable car, the top step of the podium continued to elude the prancing horses. The drought would finally end the 1994 German Grand Prix, with Berger winning by 54 seconds over second-place finisher Olivier Panis in the Ligier. Ferrari would soon return to their winning ways of the 70s after Jean Todt took over as principal. Jean and Luca would set about putting the team back on track, and put them back on track they did, winning their first World Constructors' Championship in 16 years in 1999. So, in conclusion, a racing career was irreversibly damaged, hundreds of thousands of dollars were needlessly burned, and an entire year of contention was wasted away. All because you can't slag off a Ferrari engine. This team makes me sick.